I'll get started. My name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Thursday, the 19th of June, 2025. Today is day 622 days since October 7th of 2023. This is a weekly update. The update will be about 20-25 minutes. And today actually is Juneteenth, which commemorates the day in 1865 when enslaved African Americans in Galveston, Texas, learned of their freedom, which was nearly 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. June 19th is known as Emancipation Day and is celebrated as the end of slavery in the United States. And so it's now a federal holiday. And so I wanted to be sure to acknowledge that as we get started today. I feel like that's significant as we seek the liberation of Palestinians from occupation and as there's so much war and devastation happening in the Middle East. I feel a bit remiss starting with Iran and Israel when there's so much devastation continuing and happening in Gaza. But being that that's some of the most significant news, I will start there. Yesterday was the 6th day of the ongoing bombing between Israel and Iran. So 6 days, Friday, a week ago, Israel launched what they called a preemptive strike against Iran. And that was early in the morning on Friday a week ago, and it was a dramatic escalation. There have been long-running tensions between Israel and Iran, between those two countries. Netanyahu said that the operation was targeted at preventing Iran from developing a nuclear program. He initially said that the attacks would last for as long as was needed to remove the threat. Initially, in the first few hours and the day of bombing, Netanyahu's government said that the plans that they had originated called for 14 days of bombing. So today would be day 7. The state media arm of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, it's called Tasnim, confirmed in the first day that Hussein Salami, who was the commander-in-chief of the IRGC, was killed. He was in the headquarters of the IRGC. That happened in just the first day of Israeli bombing. The U.S. stated that they were not involved in the attacks. They came out pretty quickly saying that. The Trump administration said that Israel was acting unilaterally. Secretary of State Marco Rubio came out last Friday saying we're not involved in the strikes against Iran. It's our top priority to protect American forces in the region. The Board of Governors of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN nuclear watchdog, formally found this past week that Iran was not complying with its nuclear obligation for the first time in 20 years. Now, as of about midnight last night, Jerusalem time, President Trump said that he had not, as of yet, made up his mind whether or not the U.S. would strike Iran. So that's been the big question, is whether or not the U.S. would formally get involved in terms of being engaged in offensive. We'll talk about the role that the U.S. has played over the past week in just a minute. So there's been a lot of cryptic language coming out of the White House. President Trump offered no timeline for his decision. He said, I would like to make a final decision 1 second before. Earlier in the day, yesterday, President Trump said, I may do it, I may not do it. Nobody knows what I'm going to do. The prospect of direct American involvement in the war has added to fears of wider conflagration in the Middle East. This has led to rifts actually within MAGA supporters and within Republican allies. I talked about this division pretty extensively in my daily update yesterday. So MAGA ranks are actually quite divided on whether or not the U.S. should intervene or not. I can talk about that if you have questions. I included that in my notes, and so I could share that again, after this update. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the chief supreme leader in Iran, dismissed threats that President Trump made because President Trump has called for an unconditional surrender. So that just happened in the last day or so. In Jerusalem yesterday, Israel's strikes on Iran continued for the 6th straight day. I'll talk a little bit about what the death toll has been like. U.S. Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee issued an urgent notice in the last day or so for American citizens wanting to leave Israel. He said the embassy in Jerusalem is working on evacuation flights. There's actually a cruise ship departure for those who are interested in departing Israel. The U.S. is seeking to bring home American citizens who have been caught abroad when fighting began between Iran and Israel. And there has been some conjecture that perhaps the Americans are considering an offensive attack because of the attempts to get Americans out of the Middle East. The State Department did form a new committee. They said that they've been working on arranging flights and ships to get Americans out of Israel and other parts of the Middle East. Next steps, Israel's been prepping or pressing the United States to assist in the latest effort to destroy Iran's nuclear program. And I wanted to just talk a minute about why that is. So, in large part, analysts have said that Israel does not have the capability to destroy Iran's nuclear facility because they don't have the largest bunker busting bombs. Israel doesn't have the planes that are capable of delivering them against Iranian nuclear facilities. There's also a threat of retaliation, which Iran has retaliated. We'll talk about that a little bit. But there's also the threat of a retaliation against American bases, which has not happened as of yet. Iran has prepared missiles for possible strikes against American targets. And one of the things that the U.S. has said is that the U.S. would get involved if U.S. bases or assets had been targeted. As of yet, they have not been. There's been a question about shift in strategy in Iran. Israel's been carrying out the kind of broad and brazen attacks that it long threatened to do, but as of until this past week had not yet dared to enact. So this recent campaign reflects an extraordinary shift in Israel's military doctrine since their attacks on Hamas, which Hamas has been Iran's ally in Gaza. One of the things that's happened is in the past, if there had been attacks on Iran, Hezbollah and Hamas would have intervened. And right now, Hezbollah and Hamas have not been have not had either the capabilities or they've not been intervening. So that has been a difference in terms of this recent attack and escalation between Iran and Israel. One of the other things that happened this past week is that the internet has been disrupted in Iran. Amid severe disruptions, the country's state broadcasters urged people to remove WhatsApp from their phones, claiming that messaging apps have been collecting user information, and that's been used and sent to Israel. WhatsApp has rejected those allegations. The Iranian Red Crescent in Iran has deployed over 2,700 responders across 19 different provinces in Iran as of Tuesday, according to their head of International Federation. They said that their search and rescue teams have been removing debris and trying to recover bodies of those who've been injured and trapped under the rubble. Israeli attacks on Iran. The Israeli military said late on Wednesday that they had completed series of attacks over the last several days aimed at more than 20 military targets linked to the Iranian regime's nuclear weapons development project. On Wednesday, which was the 6th day of the Israel-Iran conflict, explosions were heard throughout Tehran as Israeli warplanes continued to hammer the country. Israeli military issued evacuation warnings for another district as the exodus from the Iranian capital continued. Israel had called for Tehran to evacuate, and Israel said it attacked a centrifuge production site and several weapons manufacturing sites overnight. Iran launched 2 waves of missiles overnight into Israel and said that it used hypersonic Fatah 1 missile for the first time, but there were no reports of casualties in Israel on Wednesday. The number of missiles Israel has faced in retaliation barrages appears to have decreased over the last couple of days, but Iran says that Iran did not explain the decline. Israel said that it has destroyed more than a third of Iran's missile launchers. The Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader, said that the battle begins. This was just hours after President Donald Trump described him as an easy target. As Trump has mauled U.S. involvement, a spokesperson for Iran's foreign ministry said in an interview to Al Jazeera that any American intervention would be a recipe for all-out war in the region. Now, earlier in the week on Tuesday, there were evacuations from Tehran that intensified as Israel had called for an evacuation. Israel said that they also killed Major General Ali Shidmani. He was described as Iran's top military commander who was appointed after the earlier general had been killed in an earlier airstrike. So he'd just been appointed and then was killed after his appointment. The Natanz nuclear site has been one of significant interest. Israeli airstrikes achieved, according to reports, direct impacts on underground areas of that nuclear site. That's one of the locations where Iran enriches uranium, according to the UN Chief Nuclear Monitor. So these were reports from Tuesday earlier in the week. Iran on Tuesday had fired about 30 missiles towards central Israel on Tuesday morning. 12 people on Tuesday had been injured, according to Israel's military and emergency services. On Tuesday, it was reported that U.S. oil futures climbed 4.3%. They settled at $74.84. This was the highest closing price since January 22nd. Crude oil had spiked by 23% so far this month. This was a shift that's already seen boosting gasoline prices. Brent crude, the world benchmark, had jumped about 4% on Tuesday. Now, on Tuesday night, Donald Trump said that the U.S. knows where Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was hiding. He said, but we don't want him killed for now. This was when Donald Trump urged in a posting on social media for the unconditional surrender by Iran. That was on the 5th day of the conflict. Earlier in the week, President Trump had said, we now have complete and total control of the skies over Iran. Now, this was what was interesting, is he was using language like this while the U.S. was not actively involved in the offensive attacks of Israel, against Iran, but it still was implying that the U.S. was in collaboration with Israel's attacks. So this was a statement that was in direct contrast to the previous statements, that, Secretary of State Rubio had said, which was refuting the claims of Washington that the U.S. was not involved. And so these were contradictory statements that started to come out between the weekend and Tuesday. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, said that his nation would not surrender and again warned of irreparable harm if the U.S. were to join in strikes. Trump did meet with the U.S. National Security Team. He spoke with the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu earlier in the week. There were rumors that came out that President Trump put a kibosh on the killing of the Iranian supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And then reports came out that that was fake news. And so this was some of what we started to hear, earlier in the week. Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Yechiel, later told CNN that the U.S. provided missile defense system. He was referring specifically, but not only, to THAAD, saved hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives in Israel since Iran began their retaliatory missile strike. So after the Friday strike by Israel against Iran, while the U.S. did not engage in offensive strikes, the U.S. not only provided defense systems, the U.S. did start over the weekend knocking down missiles, and they did start in defensive support of Israel. The THAAD defense system, that stands for the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. It's a battery. It's one of the U.S. military's most powerful anti-missile weapons. It's capable of intercepting ballistic missiles at ranges of 93 to 124 miles. It has a near perfect success rate in testing. And so The Israeli ambassador to the U.S. had said that had saved, hundreds, if not thousands, of lives because of its use. On Monday, Iran's health ministry reported that Israeli attacks had killed at least 224 people in Iran. That was just between Friday and Monday. Netanyahu's office said that the total number of people killed in Israel over the weekend during that same period of time between Friday and Monday was 24 people in Israel killed. It's important to note that a number of those people were actually Arab citizens of Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel. One of the stories that got a lot of attention was a Palestinian mother and her two daughters and her sister-in-law were killed in one of the Arab Israeli towns in Israel. The Israeli Defense Minister Katz said that Tehran residents would soon pay the price for Iran's strikes on Tel Aviv and Haifa that killed at least 8 people in the day, later clarifying that there was no intention to physically harm the residents of Tehran. As of last night, Wednesday night, the death toll in Iran from Israeli attacks was reportedly 585 Iranians killed by Israeli strikes. That was a U.S. human rights NGO said at least 585 Iranians had been killed by Israeli strikes since the conflict began last Friday. The IDF said that an Israeli drone was downed in Iranian territory for the first time since Thursday night. 400 missiles had been fired from Iran at Israel, 20 of which had not been struck down, according to, that was Haaretz reporting last night. A Wall Street Journal report on Wednesday said that Israel's actually running low on their Arrow interceptor missiles. Those have been used to intercept the Iranian ballistic missiles. I've not heard reports about whether or not other European countries have been helping with the defense, but we do know that the U.S. has played that role. Earlier this week, it was reported that President Trump abruptly left the G7 summit in Canada because of what's going on in the Middle East. The White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, said. She did not elaborate. Trump later stated the reason for his departure was much bigger than trying to reach an Israel-Iran ceasefire. Trump did dispute an assessment of the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, on how developed Iran's nuclear capabilities were. She testified in March that the intelligence community continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, but Trump told reporters on Air Force One, "I don't care what she said. I think that they're very close to having it." The Trump administration told multiple Middle Eastern allies on Sunday that it will not actively join the Israel-Iran conflict unless Iran targets Americans. Now, since then, he's shifted his tone a bit. And so that's where I kind of started from on no one knows whether or not, the U.S. will engage. So the biggest question is, are Americans being evacuated out of Israel? The U.S. embassy in Israel has closed. I was actually supposed to have a meeting there next week. That will not be happening. Americans are being told to leave Israel and to leave the region. And so the big question is, does that mean that the U.S. might be, getting ready for attacks? Separately, the White House is in talks with Iran over the possibility of facilitating a meeting this week between the U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Iran's foreign minister. Israel on Saturday widened its military campaign against Iran by targeting Iran's gas and petrochemical refineries, according to a statement from Iran's oil ministry. And Trump over the weekend called for Israel and Iran to make a deal and stated that we will have peace soon and that many calls and meetings are now taking place. Trump said that he's open, I don't know if you heard this, that he's open for President Vladimir Putin to serve as a mediator in the conflict, stating that he believes Israel's attacks are likely improved or that they likely have improved the chances of reaching a nuclear deal. The U.S. Northern Command on Saturday announced that the U.S. military has stepped up their security at all military installations in the United States because of world events. And on Saturday, this was reported in local news in Israel, that 2,775 Israelis have been displaced by the war with Iran, and 24 buildings in Israel have been slated for demolition. That was reported by the finance minister Smotrich. And the U.S. State's Department did raise the travel advisory to Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza to level 4, which is the do not travel level. In the Israeli Knesset, one of the things that was supposed to happen before Israel launched the attack on Iran was there was going to be a vote on Sunday, which was going to be the first of several because of the ultra-Orthodox conscription considerations, which was going to be a no-confidence vote. A vote did move forward, but it was knocked down. And the reason that the no confidence vote for Netanyahu was blocked was because of the war with Iran. We'll talk in a minute about how actually Netanyahu's ratings have increased significantly. Iran asked Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Oman to talk to Trump and ask him to press Israel for an immediate ceasefire, offering concessions in U.S. talks. They request that those countries ask Trump to pressure Israel into an immediate ceasefire, according to 2 Iranian and 3 regional sources. There were some specific updates over the weekend. So this is older information, but there were 21 bodies in Israel of people who were killed by Iranian missile strikes. Emergency services recovered in Israel. And 631 people were wounded in Israel, according to reports because of Iranian airstrikes. 8 people were killed in an Iranian missile strike just Monday morning in Israel. 92 people were hospitalized. So those were reports just from the weekend. Also over the weekend, as the United States began to intervene, there were significant articles about after the U.S. had sat out the Iranian attacks, they began to step in. And so jet fighters, destroyers, ground-based interceptors were beginning to engage in drones and missile fire. And that was big news. The U.S. starting to, at that point, Iran had fired about 200 ballistic missiles. The way that Iran began its attacks was initially drones and then ballistics missiles. And the difference in the capabilities to cause damage, et cetera, is quite significant. And so U.S. jet fighters, Navy destroyers, ground-based air defense systems increasingly became positioned to help in a counterattack even before the U.S. began to engage. And there was a lot in the news about that over the weekend. I wanted to take just a minute and talk about why this happened at this moment. What have Israel's goals been? I think this is quite significant. I talked about this some in the daily updates over the week. Vox wrote a significant piece about what are Israel's goals. And Israel's stated goals have been to halt Iran's nuclear progress. But as I mentioned before, Israel on its own really doesn't have that capability without U.S. intervention because they don't have the right type of military equipment. So while that may be one goal to stymie some of the nuclear capabilities, one of the main questions is there a larger goal by the Israeli government to instigate a regime change in Iran? And that's been a really big question that's been asked by analysts, that's being discussed, that I think it's really important to at least mention. According to reports, President Trump, I mentioned this previously, did veto a plan for the assassination of the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. It's been said that that was fake news, but with all of the assassination of other significant leaders from, the head of Hezbollah, the head of Hamas, numerous heads of Hamas, the political wing, the military wing, et cetera, one cannot ask if that was not, at least on the table. The other question that Vox asked was, why would Israel attack Iran now? And the New York Times talked about this. They said Iran has not been doing well. There have been years of sanctions. The economy has been eroded. Israel and the United States have killed many of Iran's military leaders. Many of the proxies of Iran have been pummeled across the Middle East, not the least of which are Hamas and Hezbollah over the last, 19 plus months. All of this has limited Iran's ability to retaliate. Also, of course, the role of Russia, it being distracted in the war with Ukraine, the decimation of Iran's proxies, and particularly in terms of Israel, and its decimation has been very important. Years ago, Hamas and Hezbollah would have responded to strikes. They've not been able to. And then if you look at domestic politics, since October 7th, Netanyahu has faced conflicting political pressure from his right and left. And so the right wants a more aggressive war. The left wants Netanyahu to focus on bringing on the hostages, even if it means letting Hamas survive. Netanyahu is facing corruption charges that would land him in prison. And then you have this, no confidence vote and the requirements of the ultra-Orthodox Jews. So you have this domestic chaos, and it puts strikes on Iran in this position where there's widespread support. And so Israelis broadly see Iran as an existential threat. And so it's been a winning issue. And you've seen Netanyahu's popularity increasing. His polls increased from Friday to Monday. Monday, he even had larger gains. Israel's stock market increased by more than 5%. And so in large part, the vast majority of Israelis have been overwhelmingly supportive of the attacks on Iran. So that's one of the reasons why this moment is the attacks for Iran have been planned for a number of years. There has been espionage. Mossad talked about how they smuggled in certain equipment, etc. Whereas U.S. Congress, U.S. Senator Tim Kaine, Democrat of Virginia, introduced a resolution on Monday that would require explicit congressional authorization. He's trying to apply the War Powers Act, where there would be congressional approval before Trump would be able to engage the United States in acts of war via Iran. So that is happening on Capitol Hill in the United States. I can't believe the time has just disappeared. I'm so sorry. I want to talk for a moment about Gaza. One of the highest number of death tolls again in recent weeks. 144 Palestinians were killed in Gaza in the last 24 hours. God have mercy. Wednesday, it was reported 51 people were killed by Israeli tank fire as they were attempting to reach aid from trucks in Gaza, according to medics. Another 221 were wounded. Al Jazeera reported that at least 70 Palestinians were wounded as they sought aid in Gaza on Tuesday. Casualties were among the 89 Palestinians that were killed on Tuesday across the enclave since dawn on Tuesday. Over the weekend, at least 38 Palestinians were killed in shootings in areas where Israeli and U.S. supported food distribution centers in South Gaza. The death tolls in Gaza just continue. And one of the things that's happening is the world is paying attention to Iran and Israel, and dozens of Palestinians are not only dying of hunger and starvation, but they're dying while they're seeking food. And it's just not even being reported. And so I think it's absolutely critical that we continue to pay attention to that. The IDF also said that yesterday a Palestinian in the West Bank was killed by military gunfire after he, quote, attempted to stab Israeli soldiers, end quote. The IDF and Shin Bet also arrested over 24 people in the West Bank. I mentioned the summit that was supposed to be a peace summit that was going to focus on Gaza, being hosted by France and Saudi Arabia, that has since been postponed as well. The U.S. did close 2 other bases in northeastern Syria, which many have argued is going to allow for the resurgence of the self-styled Islamic State. That happened this week. A former senior Syrian security officer and member of the former al-Assad inner circle, his name was Bassam al-Hassan, told the FBI that Assad in 2013 ordered Austin Tice to be killed. He was a freelance journalist who was kidnapped in Syria. This is the first time a senior Assad regime official has spoken to a U.S. official about the possibility of Tice's fate. And a German court this past week sentenced a Syrian doctor to life in prison for crimes against humanity because the role he played in war crimes against the Assad regime. In the U.S., There were mass protesters who participated in the No Kings demonstrations across the United States, protesting President Trump this past Saturday. Organizers said that there were millions of people who showed up to protest in more than 2,000 cities. And the Trump administration has continued and can continue the immigration detention of pro-Palestinian activist Mahmoud Khalil over allegations of immigration violations. A federal judge ruled this past Friday. Again, that was a bit buried because of everything happening with Iran. The judge had previously found Khalil's arrest and initial detention were unlawful, and that was just overturned this past Friday. So that's an update of the news from this past week. It has not been good news, but may God go before us and may we continue in our efforts in the name of Christ. Amen.